was a time of great promise in the United States. A decade of newfound whimsy that shook America free of a 20-year standoff with hardship and conflict. It was a time when nothing that was conceived couldn't be created. Everything America touched with its industrial magic wand turned to gold. And the national obsession with finding that ever-elusive American dream seemed about to pay off. And it was a time when the automobile symbolized America's unlimited supply of economic luster. Traveling into a new era of personal freedom, cars were not only methods of transportation, but family focal points that made new experiences in new kinds of places possible. The automobile was changing the way America looked and the way it felt. The 1950s were a time for finding out what America was now offering, and for making those discoveries in automobiles that shone with the emerging optimism that had been a long time in coming. The 1950s, a time for tail fins and drive-ins. As troop ships steamed back into American ports at the end of 1945, the GIs that had helped win World War II lined the rails and savored the sights they had left behind. As these returning heroes made their own personal adjustments to peacetime, they were unaware that the country they had risked their lives to defend was about to go through some dizzying changes. Although conflict would erupt again in the early years of the next decade in a place called Korea, the overall mood and mindset of the United States in the 1950s was clearly on the upstroke. The average American, the government, and enterprising businessmen with a keen eye for picking up new trends in service and marketing were on a collision course that converged on the doorstep of this unfolding decade of change. And the automobile, which had for 40 years previously played a more practical role in the lives of most Americans, was also about to take on a new job description, as the good times were about to roll.
The automobile, up until the early 1950s, 52, 53, was pretty much a utilitarian device, except for the middle and upper middle classes, which had Buicks and Oldsmobiles and Cadillacs, and they were able to use those cars a little more recreationally. But the average Joe pretty much uses little old Ford and Chevrolet to get down the road and back and forth to work.
Americans would still depend on the family automobile for the simple task of commuting to and from their jobs. And with the appearance of another post-war manifestation, suburbia, owning a car was now more necessary than ever, as suburban communities sprouted within miles of major cities nationwide. Sprawling residential developments, patterned after the example set by Levittown and similar post-war communities, hopscotched across the United States as American veterans were now raising children, and the middle class was steadily gaining numbers. But as the American driving public was changing its relationship with the car, one thing that had not changed entering the 1950s was the aging network of roads that was now proving to be thoroughly inadequate to serve a country on the move. Then, shortly after the end of the Korean War, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, with widespread support from Congress, set into motion an aggressive initiative to create not only a new ultra-modern highway system, but a source of thousands of construction jobs for returning veterans. The creation of the interstate highway system would place an even greater emphasis on the importance of the automobile in the 1950s. America was once again mobilizing, but instead of producing the tools of war, the country was charging full speed ahead to produce multi-lane interstate highways and spacious turnpikes and toll roads, slicing across the continental United States in a comprehensive web of concrete and asphalt. Each new highway was greeted with an exuberance and fervor that up until then had been reserved for inaugurations and ship launchings. A new national attitude driven by unquenchable optimism and bolstered by an expansive highway system waiting to be taken on, was firing a warning shot to Detroit that the country was looking for cars that could match this excitement and maybe even surpass it.
We came out of World War II with brand new power plants. General Motors short-stroke high-compression V8s that were created for Oldsmobile and Cadillac in the late 1940s produced enough surplus power that was otherwise unavailable. I might say at the expense of terrible gas mileage, but who cared? So that you were able to use automatic transmissions that were being developed, to be able to build in power windows and air conditioning and power seats and power gadgetry that arrived on the scene in the 1950s, unheard of before the war. But before the war, we didn't have enough power in the engines to make all that stuff work.
The arrival of the 1950s ushered in another cultural phenomenon that would harmonize strongly with this wave of positive energy ringing throughout the country. A fascination with the future. And here, American industry was hoping to provide a crystal ball for eager consumers who wanted a piece of tomorrow now.
When we began to develop pretty sophisticated automobiles in the 1930s, naturally we're in the middle of a horrible depression. Nobody had any money, so once again we weren't going anywhere of consequence. Comes World War II, gas rationing, everybody's fighting and working in war plants, again no travel. Then comes the Cold War, pressures, inflationary pressures, post-war confusion, difficulties, not a whole lot of fun in the 1940s. Then comes Korea. So by the time we get to 1952, 53, the country has really been through almost 25 years of hard times. So we're ready to rock and roll, and we said, let's get on the roads. The interstate system was starting to be completed, or at least begun. We were looking down the road to super highways and an automotive culture that was unknown to us. We had seen the World's Fair of 1940-41, where GM's General Motors Futurama showed us these incredible 18-lane super highways in these mega cities that were going to come to us in I think 1980, something like that. I don't think we hit the schedule right on the mark, but it was there.
The rapidly evolving technologies of the 1950s had now provided faster and safer highways and more mechanically capable automobiles. But style was soon to become the marketing hot button that would send Americans surging into automobile showrooms. And the manufacturer who could win the high ground in the automotive style race was the manufacturer who would sell the most cars. But in order to do that, Detroit stylists would have to interpret the attitudes of automobile buyers and translate that national feel-goodism into steel and chrome.
There were no boundaries. It was unfettered. It was the opening of virtually any kind of vista. There were no strictures in terms of emissions, no strictures in terms of fuel mileage. The gasoline was around 50 cents a gallon, a little bit less than that in some cases. So who cares whether the thing got 9, 10 miles to the gallon? The soaring tail fin monster car look that came out of World War II, which was been attributed to Harley Earl, the chief stylist at General Motors, who was fascinated by World War II airplanes, P-38s in particular, which generated the great tail fins, and the Dagmar bumpers, which were kind of propeller spinners, and all that neat stuff that we look back on now is so unbelievably quaint and archaic and kind of corny. You know, there's the old line somebody said about a 1955 or 56 Oldsmobile, which is adorned with chrome, and from one end to the other he said, where do you put the quarter in to make it light up and play? You know, I mean, the thing was an unbelievably grotesque machine in terms of its kind of glitz and glitter. But we can't forget that this was a new arrival of optimism and a rebirth of excitement, and it was like the country was unleashed. Suddenly these arcs, these super machines, large gas hogs, the insular chariots, as the writer John Keats called them, were suddenly realities. So here we had we had peace, we had prosperity, and we had these great automobiles, and let's hit the road.
In autumn of 1954, General Motors achieved one of the decade's most remarkable milestones in the automotive arena, the production of its 50 millionth automobile.
Mark you well this day in American progress, for the scurrying clock of history is striking 10 this Tuesday morning of November 23rd, 1954. As down from aloft swings the golden body of a car that's been 46 years in the making. A car that marks a proud feat of the teamwork of American productive achievement, unmatched anywhere at any time. The manufacture by the people of one company of 50 million motor cars. This is achievement. Achievement by a great nation, by the 160 million free people of that nation.
The 1950s saw the real creation of the big three. Going into the 50s, we had Nash, we had Hudson, we had Willys, we had Studebaker, we had Kaiser Frazer, plus some other minor manufacturers, all of which went away. They consolidated themselves, and through a series of realignments, et cetera, Studebaker, Packard tried to make a go of it. Hudson aligned themselves with Nash, and then things that really spelled doom for them ultimately. So by the time we came out of the 1950s, we had three major automakers. Really, we had one, which was General Motors. Then we had a pretender in Ford, and then we had the third, Chrysler, that was up and down and chasing after the other two. But they were the dominant forces. So they basically had pretty much anything that they wanted to do, they could do. They had a very, very hungry consumer body out there. There was a little nibble of imports, a little hint of the action when the Volkswagen became important, or slightly important, got about 2 or 3% of the market in the late 50s. But overall, it was General Motors that called the tune. I mean, they were the dominant player. They controlled over 50% of the market worldwide, almost. When you think about, I believe around 1950, Detroit was producing almost 80% of the cars in the world. General Motors was producing over half of them. So there was an enormously powerful company. They'd do almost anything they wanted to, and so they were able to build whatever came off the drawing board of Harley Earl and the marketing people.
A bright new star, a glowing new star for 1957. New right down to the wheels it rolls on, with its daring departure in design, its longer, lower lines. Here's the car that's #1 in the USA, the 57 Chevrolet.
There's nothing like a Chevy but a Chevy, a sweet and smooth and sassy Chevrolet. Chevy's turbo glide.
The ever-increasing presence of television in American households would coincide with the country's rapidly spreading interest in owning a new car. Television became the primary delivery system for marketing campaigns designed to crank up enthusiasm for Detroit's newest offerings, emphasizing size and style to a public firmly convinced that when choosing a car, bigger was better.
Meet the 1957 DeSoto, barely 4 feet 7 inches from road to glamorous roof. Here in DeSoto is the exciting new shape of motion, flight sweep styling, tail fins for highway stability. This is the breathtaking beauty of Flight Sweep 57. Low, long, luxurious. Make a date now to see and drive the 1957 DeSoto. It's the most exciting car in the world today.
And the Lincolns, unmistakably the finest in the fine car field. Lincolns with road-commanding 285 horsepower engine.
Bigger is better, longer, lower, wider, the great urgings of the American public at that time, based on this constricted market that they had for 20 odd years prior to that, was the sky's the limit. We want we want the biggest, flashiest, wildest automobile we can imagine. It was like unleashing of all this pent-up desire that had existed prior to that. When you think about it, the arrival of the Chevrolet Bel Air with its small, quote, small block engine, 265 cubic inch V8, which was a very powerful, very high specific power output, opened the door for the average Joe to have a car that was not only as powerful, but as fast as his doctor's Cadillac. Suddenly, in the old days, in the pecking order of automobiles, the most expensive cars were the fastest cars. Speed related to status. Now, your plumber had as fast a car as you did. Conversely, Ford tried to sell safety in 1956-57. It was a disaster. They tried to put seat belts in cars and deep dish steering wheels and padded instrument panels, et cetera, et cetera. And the public would have none of it, which was an example, or was an expression of the attitude of the day. They wanted this kind of unfettered driving environment. They didn't want to worry about having a crash, even though it was fairly, in terms of today's driving environment, it was pretty unsafe. But they didn't want to know about it. And it was a sincere effort on the part of Ford, and it came to naught. It was only a ramification of this high-style, wide-open road mentality that came in the 50s.
Well, during the 50s was a great time because the so-called depression of the 1930s was over, and the shortages that were so prevalent in the 1940s had ended. So Americans really were ready for some fun, and the automobile was fun. You know, tail fins came in, the design of the automobiles made them into rolling sculptures. So America, like no time before, really took to the automobile. And a whole society basically formed around the automobile. You had the drive-in theaters, the drive-in restaurants, and mom-and-pop motels. The whole thing was geared towards the automobile and getting out on the road and seeing America. Well, when the new cars came out, it was a really big time because the dealers and the commercials on TV really promoted the new cars. The new car every year had so many new features. You had the built-in radios, you had the tail fins, chrome was everywhere, and it seemed that the bigger the engine or the bigger the tail fin, you could have one up on your neighbor with your car.
Milton Berle's Texaco Star Theater and Ask the Man with a Star, and television opened up marketing opportunities for gasoline that was unavailable in the pre-war era. When the 50s came along and we suddenly introduced mass marketing through television, the gasoline companies, Mobil, Gulf, Texaco, Phillips 66 made some massive inroads into marketing on a mass basis through television and through the automobile, obviously.
What's in your car? It's the foreman that counts like fuel.
Service stations had been familiar to Americans since the birth of the horseless carriage. The petroleum industry had, for the most part, relied on individual dealers of their products to shoulder the responsibility of promoting them. Motorists found varying degrees of service, fluctuating greatly from city to city and state to state. With a vigorous new marketplace responding to the increasing rhythm of the road in the 1950s, oil companies began directing their marketing efforts at convincing drivers that their service stations were uniformly fast and efficient everywhere, and perhaps even glamorous.
33, 44, 55, 66. 66. Phillips 66. That's the sign that Jimmy Orr likes. Jimmy Orr, of course, is the star pass receiver and punter of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And along with Mrs. Orr, he makes it a point to visit Phillips 66 stations whenever he goes driving. The reason?
Real good service.
And new flight fuel, the new Rhythm gasoline.
And really clean stations.
Stations that invite you to join Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy Orr. And wherever you go, have more fun going.
The combination of a strong economy, new automobile styles and engineering, clever marketing, and cheap fuel had unlocked a door for Americans that opened to not only new travel opportunities, but new business possibilities as well. Fortunes would be made, and the behavior patterns of future generations would be changed dramatically as the automobile took center stage in an ever more vibrant society. Long before it became a political catchphrase, the term family values aptly described the moral climate in America during the 1950s. Economic and social pressures had yet to fragment the family structure. The family car had become a virtual family room on wheels. And as the 50s moved forward, an idea that had actually been born 3 decades earlier in the American Southwest was now passing into an era of abundant prosperity: the drive-in restaurant.
The Texas pig stands started actually in the 1920s on the Dallas-Fort Worth Highway near Dallas, Texas. And what they did there was they had these young servers, young boys that worked there. And what happened is when the cars pulled into the parking lot, before they even got a chance to stop, these young boys would jump up on the sides of the running boards and already take the orders. And soon enough, somebody coined the term car hop, and the name stuck. And then from that point on, the car hop was the central element of the drive-in restaurant, which really made it really popular with people, because you could basically sit in your car, get service right there. You didn't have to get dressed up. You could just relax in the front seat of your automobile. So in fact, your automobile sort of became a dining room on 4 wheels.
While chain restaurants like Howard Johnson's, with its familiar orange roof and host of the highways slogan, enjoyed great popularity with their close proximity to major highways and traditional inside seating, drive-in restaurants such as A&W Root Beer appealed to the quickly growing car-crazy population. Across America, drive-in restaurants were multiplying in waves. National chains and independent operators were cashing in on what was fast becoming a singularly American ritual: eating in your car.
Drive-ins back during the 40s and the 1950s, you would get your food on a tray and it would be stacked high with large orders of hamburgers and french fries all on a regular china plate. And your milkshake would, of course, be in a large milkshake glass, you know, those huge glasses. And hopefully you'd always get the milkshake mix part, in that metal cup. You'd get the rest of it from the mixer. And, of course, you'd have real silverware. And everything had more of a style to it back then. There was no paper or plastic.
You wanted to be in your car. You wanted to be to show it off, so to speak, and there was something kind of neat about it, and getting out wasn't cool. So curb service, as it was sometimes called, or tray hop girls, that kind of thing, became very, very popular. Plus, being a male, the car hop females, as I've written some of my books, some of those females are pretty cute. And I think it had that certain sex appeal that buying it, driving through, and then going to, you know, some other place just did not have.
The drive-ins were real big during the 1950s, primarily because the teenagers in that time period really loved the drive-ins as far as a meeting and hangout place. After high school, they'd go down there and meet friends, and they'd meet other people as far as rival schools, you know, might stop by. It was a great place to go and have a snack, you know, a milkshake, foods you really couldn't get at home. And it was just sort of a certain ambiance there, where everybody could hang out together away from the parents. Of course, you had the rock and roll music blaring from the cars, so it was a special time.
Gather round, everybody, for you're about to hear this is a show that's gonna make you smile from ear to ear. It's Arnie Ginsberg on the Night Train Show. He plays the old and new, the swinging and the blue.
During the 1950s and well into the 60s, Arnie Ginsberg was the #1 nighttime rock and roll disc jockey on 50,000-watt WMEX in Boston. His nickname, Woo Woo Ginsberg, was the result of his zany use of horns, whistles, and bells scattered within his rapid-fire delivery.
And a frantic, friendly Friday night in Boston town. Old aching adenoids, Arnie Ginsberg, woo-woo, for you on the Night Train Show. All set with all the tops in pops. Brand new Wimex tuned X.
One of Ginsberg's major sponsors was a drive-in restaurant called Adventure Car Hop.
Adventure Car Hop was on Route 1 in Saugus, just north of Boston. And you'd go into Adventure Car Hop, and each night I would announce a special. Like one night it would be the Ginsburger. You say woo woo Ginsburg, and you get another Ginsburger free of charge, served on a record, which you keep for your very own. We'd have a top 10 record. So we'd have a special, and you'd go out and say woo woo Ginsburg, and you get a hamburger and a hit record and indigestion, all for one price. First of all, first time you got a driver's license, you drive out to Adventure Car Hop. And first time you got a new car or rebuilt an old one or whatever you did, that was the car place too. It was, if you wanted to see what the 50s looked like, you just had to go to Adventure Car Hop on a Friday night or a Saturday night. Wonderful. When rock and roll radio hit in the mid-50s, there was also something else happening, which was a whole new economy. The teenagers were suddenly king because there were so many of them. They had money, they were mobile, and they loved to go places and do things. They were independent of their parents. And believe me, the teenagers ruled the roost. They had their own money, they could buy cars, they were mobile, they could go to the drive-in movies, the drive-in restaurant, and pick their own meeting places. And it was a whole new era. This had never happened before for teenagers.
Steve and Marion Kamens were teenagers growing up in the northern suburbs of Boston in the 1950s. Marion worked as a car hop at Adventure Car Hop before she and Steve were married. And their 1949 Mercury, complete with authentic 1950s memorabilia, including a miniature drive-in theater in the trunk, has become an important touchstone that connects them to a fondly remembered time in their lives.
It was special. There was a lot of teenagers and older people, middle, all ages. They were very polite and nice. It wasn't like the teenagers of today. They never harassed you or, catcalls or whistled. They were just a bunch of nice kids, and they used to come there and with their groups, car groups or clubs, and they parked in certain areas, and we had a good time. It was a really good time. It was a nice time to be there.
You'd have rival gangs that if we saw each other on the street, typical teenagers, we'd cheer each other, jeer, try and incite something happening. But when you get to Adventure Car Hop, it was like a neutral ground. You'd see guys that on the street, you'd probably go and punch them in the mouth. That's how it was, right? But you'd meet there, hey, how you doing? Geez, Carl, Bob, how's everything? What do you got under the hood? And we get together, wow, how'd you do that? And this is the report that happened up there. It was like you were in God's country.
It was a great place to work. The people there were very nice. It was upbeat because of the people that came in. And it was hard work. It wasn't a playground or anything. It was hard work, but we loved it. We enjoyed it. It was the best place to be, I thought.
The 50s really worked because everybody was optimistic. Optimism was everywhere. Everyone felt there was a great future for them. And it seemed like everybody got along. There were very few negatives to the 50s. It was simple at life, but it was great. And it was very positive, and the 50s worked. They really did, with all their problems were minor. But it was a whole new culture coming up, and everybody understood it and felt part of it.
If driving and eating were two of the most popular pastimes in 1950s America, the diner could easily be called one of the most popular components of this mobile culture. During that decade, an estimated 6,000 diners were spread across the country, most in the Northeast and Southeast. Descendants of lunch wagons that became familiar sights in many northeastern cities in the late 1800s, diners offered an approach to restaurant dining that was basic and unpretentious, in an era when America was looking for the next new experience.
Back in the 50s, when people were traveling, a lot of times it was the family going out on a outing, a ride, just adventures, it seemed like, or traveling to and from family gatherings or whatnot. The diner was the perfect family restaurant. It was the first basically fast food restaurant per se, certainly family style. It was not too formal, so you could bring the kids. The kids used to like this to spin on the stools. If you could get them out of the booth, they'd be on the stools. It was a pretty good place. You could get cheeseburgers, that type of thing for the kids, and you could have a decent meal yourself and dessert, and it wouldn't cost you that much.
You'd feel very comfortable talking to someone next to you at a diner, whereas you might not in any restaurant today. There was just, we're all in this diner together, we all are enjoying the same food, the same service, or lack of service, for which diners were sometimes famous. And so it was all like one happy gang. And when I've interviewed older people about diners, that's what they say. The food may be good, maybe not, but it was the camaraderie, the being there with other people, the gang, the friendliness, that kind of thing. Almost instantly, people that dropped in for the first time became part of that group, part of that gang, and you were sharing the same wonderful meal, the same wonderful moment, in a pretty neat structure to boot.
Even if you're traveling from town to town and you've never been in this particular town before, you can stop in at the local diner and get a feeling of the what's happening in that particular area, that town. You can hear what they're talking about. You can join in the conversation. They don't mind. In fact, usually if you're from out of the area and your accent gives you away, they'll pick up on that, and you start talking about what you might have in common or what you don't have in common. It's a common denominator, sort of a democratic eating establishment, and usually very friendly, although you will find the sort of taciturn operator who doesn't say much. That's kind of rare, but it does happen.
Diners were primarily buildings that were prefabricated at a factory. They looked sort of like a dining car, like a railroad dining car. And they were usually made with a wood structure, a wood skeleton, with some kind of a metal, let's say a stainless steel exterior, which is the kind you see today, which really has defined the diner.
I happen to like the architecture of diners, the kind of shiny porcelain and the metal over porcelain, the porcelain over metal, very often a marble top counter inside. I'm the world's biggest enemy of these national chain franchises. I don't want to go 500 miles and eat in the same exact restaurant I could have eaten at home. I don't want to think my food was perhaps prepared or pre-prepared in Kansas City 2 weeks ago and shipped in. I want it locally owned by some guy or some woman who's right there, the food is prepared right there, and the place doesn't look like every other place.
It's usually a family-run business, so therefore you don't get that unfriendliness or indifference you might get at other type of restaurant. Especially if you're a regular customer, they know usually what you're going to order before you come in the door.
The key to judging a diner used to be how many trucks were out front. If there were a lot of trucks, that meant a lot of good food and probably a low price, plus the camaraderie. So it was a good combination, but you were sure to have a good meal. Yeah, diner owners were all locally owned. Generally speaking, the guy who owned it or the woman who owned it did the cooking, so they were right there, and they were going to make sure. And they often cooked right in front of you, so you could watch them, and if something fell on the floor, you know darn well they weren't going to serve it to you.
If you got Western coffee, it's a cup of coffee you didn't really want because it's been on the range all day.
The Palace Diner in Biddeford, Maine, looks and operates today much the same as it did 40 years ago. It has defied the encroachment of change, as owner Peter Beaudoin still works the grill with practiced precision each morning.
It's a small, bright red diner. I mean bright red. And there are no tables, there are no booths. I think there are 16 stools I counted once. Pete, the guy who owns it, does the cooking. Also the only parlor diner left in the entire world. Parlor was a rather small diner manufacturing company in Lowell, Massachusetts, that put out a fair number of diners back in the 1920s, one of which was the Palace, and that's been sitting in Biddeford since 1926. It's not only Maine's oldest diner, I think it's far and away the prettiest. The reason it's called the Palace is because, and I tracked down the first owner, who's now in his 90s, when he was down there watching it come off the assembly line. It was made in Worcester, Mass., home of many, many famous diners. One of the employees said, "God, that looks like a little palace." And he said, "That's the name." So that's where the name came from. And it is. It's a little palace.
About 8 years, I would say.
And then with pants only like 35, right?
30 years.
The menu was, it was fairly simple. But you could get, say, an open sirloin steak sandwich, French fried potatoes, tossed salad, rolling butter for $1.50, and that was the dinner menu. And in fact, it's one of the highest prices on this particular menu. I think the only other thing, open lobster salad sandwich for $1.50, and that was with tartar sauce, golden brown French fried potatoes. That's a real menu jargon here. Golden brown was a real fun thing, you know. Coleslaw and rolling butter for $1.50. I wish we had those prices today, I'll tell you that much.
While drive-in restaurants and diners provided families in the 50s with a kind of communal dining experience that fit perfectly with their automotive dependency, the 50s also saw the emergence of another vehicular phenomenon that soared to new popularity, thanks in part to the magic of moonlit skies and young love.
The show starts in 5 minutes. And now, on with the show.
The drive-in theater reached its height of popularity in the 1950s, enhanced by its provocative image as a place where teenaged couples could discover the joys of romance with little risk of parental interference. But the drive-in theater was born decades earlier, with more family-oriented goals in mind, long before its innocently forbidden personality took shape. The Saco Drive-In in Saco, Maine, is one of only a handful of drive-in theaters still operating in the Northeast. But it still exemplifies the unique aura that outdoor cinemas brought to the 1950s.
Well, it opened in July 15th, 1939, which I think makes it one of the oldest, certainly 40 drive-ins in the entire world, and perhaps the still in existence oldest operating drive-in in the entire world, which I think is pretty impressive. I say that because the drive-in, the first one was opened in the summer of 1933 in Camden, New Jersey, and because it was Depression time and because the inventor took out a patent 1,909,000, something like that, on the configuration, the layout, and that sort of thing. And people who built drive-ins had to pay him an upfront fee. His name was Hollingshead from Camden, and a percentage of the gross. And this was Depression, and people just didn't want to risk that. Also, the so-called hard-top theaters, the indoor theater owners did not like the idea of drive-ins, so they made it very difficult for drive-ins to get top-rate movies. So often the drive-ins got, grade B and grade C. So between that combination of things, there were virtually, or very few drive-ins built throughout the rest of the 1930s. When this one opened up, it was far and away the first one in the state of Maine, July, once again, 15th, 1939. And it would be 10 years later before the second drive-in opened. It was July of 1949, up the road a little bit toward Portland. Admission was 35 cents for adult, kids under 12, and cars were free. And it was called the Saco Open Air Auto Theater. I love that name, the Saco Open Air Auto Theater. So it's kind of a historic structure in terms of drive-in theaters and kind of hallowed grounds, you might say. Out front, there were still remnants of some masonry. There was like a fountain, there was a doe on top looking down, there was a bear, you can still see his footprints enjoying the water, and there was water going up and water coming down. And there are urns all around and like lights and stuff. And it really, even though it's faded, it definitely shows faded elegance. This theater was not built just to show movies, not just to be functional. It was built to be beautiful, to be kind of a park-like setting you would come to and enjoy the outside as much as the inside. Truly a thing of beauty, actually.
Drive-in theater, the big attraction there was that you could go with a whole carload of people. Everybody could go in one vehicle. And you didn't have to get dressed up again. You could just go as you are. People who had problems, like the elderly or people who had physical handicaps, they had no problem at all going to the drive-in theater. But more important, there was sort of a festival atmosphere at the drive-ins. It was sort of a fun, all-around entertainment venue. You had, some drive-ins had the sort of a playground for kids between the screen and the cars, so the kids could play there while you were watching your movie. Of course, you had the snack bars where all kinds of foods were available. Some drive-ins even had vendors driving around in little carts or little vehicles between the cars taking orders. So it was more of a big gathering place where, you know, you got together with people, but at the same time you had that privacy in the front seat, which was a big thing. And also the privacy in the back seat, of course, which really earned the drive-in a bad reputation in some places.
It legitimized things that you had to do on backcountry roads to a point where it was unbelievably popular among teenagers, of course. But I think that the whole notion of being able to drive someplace and do something like go to a movie was so new and kind of revolutionary that people caught on to it and loved it just for the kind of daring quality that it represented in 1955 or whenever, 1950 or whenever those things started to happen.
With the teenagers going to the drive-in movie, you know, pick up a date, and the drive-in movie was kind of the makeout center, and that was really the thing to do. You'd go to the drive-in movie, and it was just part of the culture, and that was your evening's fun. Also, getting into the drive-in theater, you'd try and see how many kids you could get into the trunk. The trunks were pretty big in those days, you know, with the big old cars, and you'd say, well, there's only 2 of us going to the movie, and then when they get in there, you know, the kids would get out of the trunk and into the car. But that would be fine with the drive-in operators because they'd sell a lot of popcorn, food, and everything else. It all works out in the end.
Because after World War II, there was pent-up buying demand. Suddenly you could buy a car, suddenly you could buy gasoline, suddenly you could go places, and there was pent-up raising family demand too. So you had the combination of the family, little kids sprouting up, so to speak, this new car, and roads were built all over the place, and drive-ins just fit into that mode. You wanted to be in your car, and you wanted to be with your kids and your family, and it was really kind of a neat setup, actually. There were no parking problems, no babysitter. The kids in the back could scream, they could, you know, yell at each other. It might spoil it for you, but not for anyone else. And it was a very intimate, private experience that I think generations now sadly miss out on, actually.
In the period between 1943 and 1953, there was approximately 850 regular sit-down theaters that opened up, new operations. This was opposed to the some 2,900 drive-in theaters, or ozoners as they were called, that opened between that same period. So I'd say in the mid-50s there were thousands, at least 5,000 or more drive-ins in the United States.
You're sitting in this thing that you know, this box called a car, and you know this box, and there in front of you is this giant screen that you don't know, and you don't know what's going to be on it. So it's the known and the unknown, and you're sharing this together with your family. I think that kind of sums up the appeal to me, anyway.
In Wellfleet, Massachusetts on Cape Cod, the Wellfleet Drive-In is another surviving throwback to an era when countless drive-ins in countless cities and towns provided another kind of escape for Americans which could only be enjoyed in an automobile. Carefully maintained and still showing first-run features, it not only survives, but prospers.
The movie business has always been a fascinating business to me because there's no way that you can determine how many customers you're going to get on any given night. And I don't care how many computers you have or anything else, you cannot determine what the two-footed animal is going to do, whether he's going to come to the movies or he's going to go do something else. But there's not really too much entertainment down here. So in the early days, why we got more than our share of customers. They started out paying 85 cents. Which I had people complain with, oh, I can go to the movies at home in Connecticut for 60 cents. I said, fine, Connecticut's that way, you know. But who'd ever have thought that today you'd charge $6 in the drive-in and not one person ever complained. And the drive-in certainly has had a renaissance. It's been incredible.
So many different people can enjoy it. Families can come bring their kids. They come all the way from Boston just for the night, and they'll pack the kids in, pack some food or eat here, make it a day, and the kids can fall asleep, the older kids can watch, the parents can watch, and then they drive back home. the young people, it's a nice place to go out on a date if they want to have something to drink, or they can smoke at their seat, where now the indoor theaters you can't smoke, and so you know, they like it too. But a lot of people like it just because it's nostalgic. People will come and they'll say, oh, I wanted to show my kids a drive-in. We had drive-ins. I want them to share the experience. And so you get people, and we're the only one on the Cape now, so it makes it, you know, finally we have a little foothold. So they come, and they'll come 100 miles just to come.
Inside the projectionist building, Bill Hitchcock operates the original RCA carbon filament projectors that have been on duty since the drive-in opened in 1957. The same year that Bill learned his trade, right in this booth.
I work here mainly because I really enjoy working here. I don't really need the money. I'm retired. And I work here because I enjoy it. Yeah.
The popcorn can't be beat. The sparkling drinks are just dandy. The chocolate bars and the
We bought the property for like $34,000, and a couple of years ago somebody offered me over $1 million for it, you know. And I said, well, if I sell it for $1 million, I'll pay $500,000 in taxes. Where am I going to go with the other thing? You know, what am I going to build? Where am I going to live? Or can I take my dogs for their walk so that they can run loose in the wintertime and stuff like that? And I decided, no, I don't need the money.
When, as a teenager, we snuck in many ways in the drive-in because that was the sport of the day. And so when I was in the ticket booth for many years, we used to catch many people, and we did have some funny scenes catching them. And this one friend of mine, Mary Burt, she was catching them right and left, catching people sneaking in, and we catch them right at the gate there. And I said, I got to catch somebody tonight. And one of the local kids came in, and I said, open your trunk, I know you have someone in there. And he said, no, look, the trunk's broken, there's nobody in there. And I said, yes, there is. And I go in the back seat, and I pull out the back seat, and I put my hand in, and there's a head of hair. There were 2 people in the trunk. That was the best one.
If you tried to describe to kids today what it was like to have mom and pop grocery stores on every street corner, and you could go in and the storekeeper knew you and you knew him, they'd look at you a little strange and say, where are you coming from, you know? And I think if you go forward 30, 40 years in time and all the drive-ins are gone and you try to tell somebody about drive-ins, they'll say, this guy's weird, you know, and, you know, you can't really do it. You can't really do it.
Since its gates first opened, 3 generations of families have been coming to enjoy a movie at the Wellfleet Drive-In. Several of its younger employees have moms or dads or grandparents that either visited this drive-in or were employed by it over the past 40 years. It remains a living, enduring testament to a time in our not-too-distant past when America shared many an evening with family or friends in a comfortable sedan or station wagon, parked before the towering expanse of a massive screen filled with our favorite movies, under a canopy of fading sunlight. What seemed like an insatiable wanderlust that America had surrendered to in the 1950s fell victim to a changing national attitude and a less galvanized family unit in the 1960s and 70s.
I'd say the drive-in started to disappear more during the end of the 1960s and towards the beginning of the 1970s, when fast food really came in with a full vengeance. You had the drive-through window coming in then where people could just drive up to a speaker box and make their order. So it really cost too much money really to keep the drive-ins for some operators, because you had to pay car hops and pay for all of those accessories like the plates that were getting stolen or lost and the silverware. It just wasn't cost effective.
It costs a lot of money to upkeep the drive-in, and real estate dealers come along, they see a big tract of land, and they say, I'll give you $1 million for the space that your drive-in's sitting on, and the owner of the theater says, I'll take it. And that's basically what's happening.
Great deal of nostalgia. I've had a lot of people tell us this over the years. That they really, I think that they would be totally devastated if the drive-in ever would have disappeared.
People were getting a little lazier, actually, towards the 60s, where they didn't even want to get out of the car anymore. It seemed they were so mobile that they didn't even want to leave the confines of the car to eat. And diners themselves started feeling this pinch from the fast food industry. And in fact, the manufacturers at that point started changing the look of their product to make them look more like regular restaurants, to try to maybe change clientele a little bit, try to get people away from the fast food restaurants, that whole flashy look. That's why you lost the stainless steel look on the outside. It looked more like a restaurant. They were a lot larger generally. And they were trying to live with the times as well. They had to change as well.
I think with the disappearance of the drive-ins, we've lost a whole service attitude that was really prevalent in America during the 1950s. Now it's so impersonal. You go to a drive-through restaurant and you have to talk to basically a computerized menu board. So you've lost some of that special feeling of actually interacting with real human beings. And I think that's a real problem today in some of the service establishments on the roadside.
It was just a great time. And every time they close another drive-in movie, you know that a part of history is going down. It would be great if they would reopen them. Even the few drive-ins that are left, and I'm not even sure where they are anymore, but they've been steadily going down. And even the diners, you know, the diners that they have, they've been sort of closing down. That whole era is gone, and they should bring them back.
The last bunch of automobiles that I would like to own would be cars in the 1950s. I mean, they were great arcs, awful to drive, oversized, overpowered, generally frightening automobiles to drive down the road. Had tiny little drum brakes, this very, very archaic suspension system, wobbly kind of yacht-like steering. I can't imagine climbing into one of those things and driving it the way people drove it. I mean, people drove very quickly on two-lane highways. It's a miracle anybody survived if we look back and, on that era versus our airbagged, supercar, crash-worthy, ultra-high efficiency automobiles of today, which are light years better. And anybody that says they don't build them like they used to is nuts, because these cars are radically, infinitely better than anything we built in those days. So I have no interest in going back to the 1950s. You can if you want to.
I think I would like to go back. I would like to go back for a little while. Knowing what I know today and being at the point I am today, I would like to go back and enjoy it more. I think we enjoyed the times, but we didn't know it. We didn't know we were going to lose it. So yeah, I would like to go back.
You know, I think it might be nice if I could go back, you know, to 1 week and be able to go to a drive-in movie theater and a drive-in restaurant, listen to some good old 50s rock and roll, dance some 50s rock and roll, jitterbug or Lindy, that kind of thing. I think it'd be nice to do for a week. But I think I'd be disappointed. I'd say the song doesn't sound as good, the food doesn't sound as good, and you know, the movie theater isn't quite as good either. So I think there's some of that, to be perfectly honest. But boy, I'd like to try it for a week. Who knows, I might be wrong. I might love it, I might want to stay there, time warp.
People just their lifestyles changed, and now they're thinking back on it and saying, wow, we used to have this, what happened? And now they're gone, or, you know, almost gone.
I just like the individualness of diners, of the drive-in restaurants, of these. Everyone was different to a certain extent. And I think we're losing that. We're becoming a nation of sameness and of blandness. People drive hundreds of miles, eat the same food in the same chain, stay in the same motel chain. Why? Why not just stay home? And I feel very strongly. So there's that inner drive that says I'm perhaps helping to save and keep in business some of these really places that I think are truly wonderful and unique, and we're losing them, sad to say.
It was a time of unwavering optimism. It was a time when America's naive instincts told an entire country that happiness was within reach and life would be good. Automobiles would carry Americans into the front lines of style and excitement, and every child would inherit the fruits of an upwardly spiraling prosperity. But times changed, and as a country, so did America. And although much of what America built and enjoyed in that up-tempo decade of neon and chrome is gone, what remain are the memories and lingering images of tail fins and drive-ins.